In the span of just a few years, America's most powerful machines, from coast-to-coast icons to obsolete iron, were sidelined by the thousands, casualties of a relentless push for efficiency. Faced with a surplus too massive to scrap, railroad corporations turned to the Southwest desert, where forgotten rows of steam locomotives vanished into miles-long graveyards, their fate determined not by value, but by climate. How did steam's sudden death create a hidden landscape of stranded giants? And what was lost in the rush to leave them behind? Railroad boardrooms in the early 1950s faced a simple calculation. Diesel locomotives could run twice as far on a gallon of fuel, needed only a fraction of the maintenance, and cut labor costs by up to 70%. Each mile traveled by diesel cost less than half what it did for steam. For the executives, the math was impossible to ignore. Orders for new diesels poured in. By 1955, American railroads were buying more than 1,000 diesel units a year, while steam deliveries dropped to near zero. Within just 5 years, entire steam fleets, some less than 2 decades old, were sidelined. The numbers tell the story. In 1949, the country ran more than 20,000 active steam locomotives. By 1960, fewer than 500 remained in service. The rest, thousands of tons of iron and steel, stood idle in yards from Chicago to Los Angeles. Railroads suddenly had a surplus measured in billions of dollars, with nowhere to send it. Scrapping capacity lagged far behind, and the glut of obsolete engines outpaced every plan for disposal. For railroad management, the problem was not just mechanical. These machines represented stranded capital, trapped on the balance sheet and rusting on the rails. Internal memos from companies like Union Pacific and Santa Fe show growing anxiety over the mounting costs of storage, insurance, and taxes. Yet the economics of diesel were too good to reverse. The steam era had ended not with a gradual decline, but with a wave of retirement so swift that entire classes of locomotives vanished in a single season. The question was no longer how to run them, but where to hide them. Scrapyards across the country found themselves buried under a backlog of steam engines. Dismantling a single locomotive was slow, dirty work, sometimes taking weeks and a small army of laborers. By the late 1940s, the major yards were already operating at capacity, handling not just locomotives, but also boxcars, passenger coaches, and worn-out freight equipment. The sudden wave of steam retirements only made things worse. There simply were not enough skilled hands or cutting torches to keep up. Moving these iron giants posed its own problems. Transporting a retired engine to a distant scrapyard could cost more than the metal was worth. Each locomotive weighed over 100 tons, and many sat hundreds of miles from the nearest dismantling facility. Railroads hesitated to clog their main lines with deadweight, especially when the engines themselves could not move under their own power. Specialized crews and equipment were needed just to get them off the property. The economics did not help. Scrap steel prices in the years after World War II were unpredictable, swinging wildly from month to month. In some years, the value of a whole locomotive barely covered the cost of hauling it away. Labor costs kept rising, while the post-war construction boom meant that even when prices spiked, scrapyards were more interested in easier, more profitable jobs, like shipbreaking or recycling automobiles. Locomotives, with their thick castings and layers of asbestos, were the last thing most yards wanted. As a result, thousands of steam engines sat in limbo. Storage yards filled up. Sidings overflowed. Railroad managers, desperate for a solution, began looking far beyond the city limits toward the open, arid spaces where time and climate might buy them a little more breathing room. Railroad executives turned to the deserts of Nevada, Arizona, and California for a reason that went beyond cheap land or remote geography. In the arid Southwest, humidity levels can drop below 10% for much of the year. This matters for steel. Without moisture in the air, oxidation slows to a crawl. Locomotives left in these conditions rust only a fraction as quickly as they would in the Midwest or Northeast. The science is simple. Water vapor in the air accelerates corrosion, and the desert offers almost none. Railroads began moving engines out to these remote stretches, sometimes by the dozen, sometimes in long, silent caravans. They laid out storage grids on unused track, arranging locomotives nose to tail across miles of open country. Some sites, like those near Cobber and Gerlach in Nevada, stretched so far that from the air, the rows of engines blurred into rust-colored bands. Others, tucked into dry valleys in California or along the fringes of Arizona's high plains, remained hidden from passing travelers and mostly absent from official maps. These locations were not chosen at random. Company engineers studied climate charts, rainfall records, and prevailing wind patterns. The goal was to buy time, years, even decades, before the engines decayed beyond salvage. With scrapyards overwhelmed and the market for scrap steel unreliable, the desert became an unofficial warehouse for the industry's past. Here, engines could wait, preserved by sun and sand, until the economics of disposal or recovery finally made sense. For the public, these graveyards were invisible, tucked far from city limits, out of sight and out of mind. But for the railroads, the desert was a calculated bet against time and the elements. Railroad accounting departments faced a problem that could not be solved with a cutting torch. Each idle locomotive represented not just a machine, but a line item, an asset still on the books, with a value that had to be justified to shareholders and the IRS. In the 1950s, companies like Union Pacific and Santa Fe held thousands of steam engines, with original purchase prices running as high as $200,000 each. Even after years of depreciation, the combined book value of these sidelined fleets ran into the billions of dollars. A memo from Santa Fe's finance office in 1953 put it plainly. Retirement of steam power at current rates would result in unrecoverable losses exceeding $120 million unless assets were preserved for future write-down. The logic was cold, but clear. Scrapping a locomotive triggered a tax bill, because the difference between its book value and the scrap price counted as a loss, but not one the company could always deduct. Selling an engine outright risked even more exposure, since any proceeds over the depreciated basis were taxed as ordinary income at corporate rates, topping 50%. Desert storage, by contrast, offered a kind of financial purgatory. Locomotives could be listed as retired to storage, keeping their value alive on the balance sheet, as long as they remained technically available for service, or at least not formally scrapped. Their book value could be written down slowly, year by year, against future profits. This practice, known as retirement replacement betterment accounting, became a quiet industry standard. It allowed companies to defer losses, preserve future tax shields, and avoid immediate hits to earnings reports. The numbers made the decision easy. In 1955, the cost to store a locomotive in the Nevada desert averaged less than $100 per year, while immediate scrapping could erase hundreds of thousands of dollars in future tax deductions. For railroads, the desert graveyards were not just a place to hide obsolete machines. They were a financial strategy designed to minimize losses and stretch accounting rules as far as possible. The result was billions of dollars stranded in steel, waiting for a better day or a more favorable balance sheet. In the roundhouse towns of the Southwest, the end of steam was not just a technical shift. It was a sudden erasure of livelihoods. Shops that once echoed with the clang of hammers and the hiss of steam went silent in a matter of months. Payroll ledgers from places like Barstow, Kingman, and Sparks show the story in numbers. Maintenance crews slashed from hundreds to a handful, annual payrolls dropping by more than half between 1950 and 1955. For men like Sam Ortega, a machinist at the Santa Fe Roundhouse in Winslow, Arizona, the change was immediate. "They told us on a Friday," Ortega recalled in a 1974 oral history, "that the last steam job was done. By Monday, half the shop was gone." Jobs that had been passed from father to son vanished overnight. Firemen, who had spent decades learning the rhythms of coal and water, found their skills unwanted. Boilermakers, pipe fitters, and roundhouse foremen, roles that had anchored entire families, were left with little hope of retraining. In many of these towns, the railroad was the main employer. When the work dried up, so did the business at local diners, hardware stores, and boarding houses. School enrollments fell. City budgets shrank as tax revenue from the railroad evaporated. In Newburgh, Missouri, the population dropped by nearly 40% in a decade. In Clark County, Nevada, unemployment spiked from 4 to 18% after the roundhouse closures of 1953. For many, there was no safety net. Railroad companies offered few retraining programs, and most steam specialists were in their 40s or 50s, too old for new trades, too young to retire. Some moved to distant diesel shops, accepting lower pay and uncertain futures. Others left railroading altogether, their expertise lost. The ledgers and memos captured the numbers, but the real cost was measured in shuttered homes, empty storefronts, and the memories of men like Sam Ortega. As the engines disappeared into the desert, so did the communities that had kept them running. Steam locomotives sent to the desert faced three main fates, each leaving a different mark on the landscape. In some graveyards, the engines were stripped methodically for parts. Crews removed anything that could be reused: brass bearings, copper piping, air pumps, and even the heavy steel rods that once drove the wheels. These salvageable components often found their way into the dwindling steam fleets still in service, or were sold to metal dealers in distant cities. What remained was a shell, gutted boilers, empty cabs, and wheels frozen in place, bearing the scars of quick removal and hard bargains. Other locomotives were eventually hauled away and melted down. When scrap prices ticked upward, railroads organized shipments to steel mills, sometimes moving dozens of engines at a time. The process was slow and rarely profitable. A single locomotive could weigh over 200,000 pounds. But by the time it reached the furnace, much of its value had already been lost to rust and looters. Steel from these engines sometimes reappeared in new construction, in bridges, in rebar, or even in the frames of modern diesel locomotives. But the connection to their past was erased in the heat of the foundry. Yet for every engine broken down or burned away, many more were simply left as they arrived. Rows of intact locomotives stretched for miles, lined up nose to tail across the desert floor. Paint faded to bare metal, glass shattered by the wind, but the basic shape remained. Identification numbers could still be read on the tenders. Builders' plates, stamped with dates from the 1920s and 1930s, clung to the sides. In these silent rows, the graveyards became something more than storage or scrap. They turned into accidental archives, time capsules holding the details of a vanished era. Each locomotive, whether stripped, melted, or left whole, carried a different story of how America moved on from steam and what it chose to leave behind. The desert graveyards sat undisturbed for years, their existence known only to railroad accountants and a handful of workers. That changed when photographers and independent historians, drawn by rumors and scattered reports, began to seek them out. In the late 1960s, black and white images of endless rows of weathered engines first appeared in regional magazines and railroad journals. These early explorers, sometimes driving for hours across empty highways, documented builders' plates stamped with dates from the 1920s and 1930s, and captured the eerie symmetry of locomotives lined up in the sand. Their work transformed the graveyards from forgotten industrial waste into accidental monuments. What once looked like scrap now carried the weight of history. For the first time, the public glimpsed these hidden archives, rusting reminders of an era that had vanished almost overnight. The story of America's steam age was no longer just numbers in a ledger. It was preserved in steel and sun-bleached paint, waiting to be rediscovered. Preservationists soon collided with railroad corporate secrecy. Companies kept graveyard locations off maps and restricted access, wary of liability and unwanted attention. Internal memos from Union Pacific and Santa Fe flagged growing risks: asbestos insulation in boilers, lead paint flaking into the sand, and oil pooled beneath battered tenders. Cleanup costs soared into the millions. A 1979 estimate put full remediation for a single site at over $4 million, not counting legal fees or insurance hikes. For activists, these graveyards were irreplaceable archives, not hazardous waste. They pressed for public access and museum partnerships, arguing that the engines carried the story of entire communities. Railroad lawyers countered with warnings about trespass, vandalism, and environmental lawsuits. The battle lines hardened. Every new campaign to save a locomotive ran into closed gates and red tape, while companies weighed the price of preservation against the threat of regulatory action. The fate of the graveyards hung in the balance, shaped by competing visions of risk and remembrance. In the 21st century, the last secrets of the desert graveyards unraveled from above. Digital mappers, armed with commercial satellite images and open-source tools, began tracing faint lines across Nevada and Arizona, discovering grids of rusted engines that had slipped from memory. What railroad executives once kept off maps, satellites rendered unmistakable. Parallel rows of iron stretching for miles, visible as scars on the earth. The graveyards, long hidden by distance and corporate silence, became public record overnight. Researchers cataloged engine models, counted the hulks, and matched serial numbers to vanished rosters. The pattern was not unique to the Southwest. In Bolivia, satellite scans revealed the train cemetery at Uyuni, where British-built steam engines from the 1890s weathered salt winds on the edge of the Salar. Aviation boneyards, electronic waste dumps, and ship graveyards appeared in the same digital surveys, each a monument to rapid technological change. The desert locomotive fields, once invisible, now stood as part of a global archive, reminders that every leap forward leaves something behind. Today, as technology accelerates, entire industries can vanish in a single generation. The rusting engines in the desert remind us that progress always leaves something behind, sometimes on a scale too vast to erase. What we choose to preserve and what we let disappear reveals as much about our future as our past. The graveyards still wait, asking if we're paying attention. Share your thoughts below.